Thank you very much, Alison. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you to everybody who's signed in, and I'm looking forward to the questions and comments. I'm only going to speak for about 25 minutes, half an hour, absolutely maximum. And I want to start by saying that I think that this book's quite unusual. It's unusual partly because people like anthropologists, sociologists and economists have done quite a lot of studies into how people see the economy in a broad way, how they see money in their everyday lives. But political scientists, while we look at very specific things about what people think of the economy, like whether they think GDP is rising or falling, have not tended to do broad-ranging studies about how people see the economy. And I think it's important that political scientists do this, because the way someone thinks about money in their everyday life is quite different when they're considering behaving politically, going into a ballot box. So essentially, I hope that there will be more of these kinds of studies, because I think it's a very important area. And not least, as I was finishing writing this, it felt as if we were living in Brexit Britain, but we're obviously also about to enter a period of totally uncharted territory in terms of the economy with COVID-19. And only today there were reports of a survey that only 6% of people YouGov asked said they wanted a return to the same economy after COVID. So I hope that this will give a sense of what we came into COVID with, and we can obviously talk about how perceptions of the economy might change in the future. Just to start, I'd like to say a bit about the approach to the research and what it was I was looking at, because again, this isn't like an anthropology where I was saying to people anything that comes into your mind when you think of the economy. I was wanting to get the pictures that came into their mind when they heard mainstream politicians talking about it. So the politician who was most dominant at the time, who'd been Chancellor since 2010, was obviously George Osborne. But in some ways, George Osborne spoke in the broadest sense about the economy in a similar way to John McDonnell. I mean, John McDonnell might be annoyed to hear me say that, but in a very broad way, the way most mainstream politicians talk about the economy and that it gets reported is the economy is just a shorthand term. They usually talk about it as if it's obviously very important. And since, let's say, the 1980s, often there's a bit of a tone about it, shared less by John McDonnell here, but certainly by Conservative politicians, that there is a free market imperative and that there is a limit to how much politicians can interfere in the economy to steer it in certain ways. And a lot of writers in politics have described this as a process of depoliticizing the economy. So I wanted to get a sense of what goes through their minds when they hear mainstream politicians' media commentary in the news about the economy. And I also knew that if I just said to people, define the economy, it might not go very far, because the economy as an overarching concept is quite hard to talk about. So when most politicians were talking about the economy in the abstract, they also tended to mention about 8 common features. So the most common that they would tend to talk about in the same breath are displayed in the PowerPoint. And you'll notice that obviously I was doing the fieldwork 2016 to 2018. So there were two quite Brexit related features of the economy that a lot of people were talking about in the shape of trade and the economic effects of migration. In addition, I also asked them, you know, what do you think of the economy itself, the economy overall? And I asked a couple of other questions I can talk a bit more about in the Q&A. One was how economic they thought their vote in the referendum was, because there was this huge narrative that Remain voters tended to think the economy was very important, Leave voters that it wasn't. And finally, a question about economic experts, because this was the time that Michael Gove had achieved great prominence in saying that there was a distrust of experts. Now, the people that I was talking to, if I can just give a sense of the city on the south coast, and in order to talk to people from a range of backgrounds, I chose two contrasting districts. So you've got there on the right-hand side the two images from the low-income district in the city. And if you look at the top, there was one area where there were one-bedroom flats for older people, council flats. And that then extended into a bigger council estate that had been built in something like the 1940s that had slightly larger houses in it for families. And this council estate had had a really thriving shopping high street with a butcher and a baker and so on. But because it was on the edge of the university area, you can see in the bottom right photo, it had got a bit run down, and actually most of the shops along it had become takeaways. And I ended up interviewing, because I could do a certain amount of participant observation, but with a subject like this, people don't break out into talk about it naturally that much. So there did need to be an interview element. 36 people who could be described as low income, below the median income. And to give two examples, one of them, Beverly, who'd been born on that council estate, started off with her parents living with her grandmother, described how when a house came free that her parents could move into around the corner, they would take their belongings in a wheelbarrow to move into a house around the corner. And she's still living in that estate today, as are at least two of her children. So quite a community feel to it, but a sense that for nearly all the people I spoke to, their working lives had been going downhill. In the case of Beverly, she is trained as a telephonist. She's now about 65, but she found that whole buildings disappeared around her, in the sense that either the city as it deindustrialized would that office would close down, or the technology of being a telephonist would change. She ended up in very unskilled, low status work. Similarly, Elliot, who's now in his 70s, had started off as a marine engineer, you know, sort of semi-skilled in northern shipyards, but when they'd closed down, had moved into the nuclear decommissioning industry, doing quite heavy work there, was worried, became worried about the health effects of it. And so when he moved to the south for other reasons, found that actually the only kind of work he could do was with an agency, being a security guard, doing driving, so that the last period of his life he felt had been in increasingly casualised employment, low skill and lower status than he'd originally been involved in. As well as the 36 participants that I interviewed in the low-income district, which I called Hill District, I also went to Church District, about a mile to the south, and the two photos on the left are from there. The top one shows you that it's the welcome sign to the area with a church and trees. This was a very leafy, mainly Edwardian conservation area right in the centre where I did most of the interviews. And in contrast, most of the people living there were owner-occupiers. Even if they had been not in particularly well-paid professional work, they'd obviously, if they bought their homes about 20 years ago, found themselves with a very appreciating asset. And about 6 of the 24 people in the high income district were from the business world, but the rest of them did tend to be quite professional, university, medicine. The kinds of words they used about themselves were comfortable and secure, whereas the kinds of words that people in the low income Hill district used about themselves were that they were managing and that they were just about getting through, although in some cases they felt that they weren't getting through. There was high levels of payday loan debt and some really quite extreme cases of poverty in that district as well. So the aim was to ask ordinary people what they think about the 8 features of the economy and the economy overall, the kind of pictures that go through their minds when they hear politicians and mainstream commentators talking about the economy. Now, if I talk about the main findings, you can sum it up, first of all, by saying that there was such a difference between the two districts. I hadn't thought there would be such a difference. I had thought in the beginning there might be a lot of differences between men and women, that there might be quite a lot of differences according to which political party participants supported, so that, you know, most of the Conservative voters, whether they were wealthy or poorer, would tend to see the economy in some ways in the same way. And I was really struck that over and over again, the main difference seemed to be according to whether people were low income or high income. So it even affected the way people pronounced the economy. In the high income district, people tended to put the stress on the second word. So they would say the economy, as if it was what they were familiar with, a kind of taken for granted phenomenon. Whereas in the low income district, they put the stress on the first word and talk about it as the economy, as a way of contrasting between their own economies. They just didn't really feel that the economy, the national economy, related to their own lives in the same way. And while the book is all, as much as possible, about their words and analysing thematically what they say, it is also instructive sometimes for people who do qualitative work to count. And in similarly lengthed interviews, because people tended to talk a lot about things like employment and inflation and so on, it was really striking again that people in the high income district used the words the economy 3 times more than people in the low income districts, almost as if people in the low income districts, it's just not something that they feel is so familiar to them or that they are at ease with. In a bit more detail then, if we go to Church District, the high income district, quite a familiar approach was the idea of a ship of state, that the economy was synonymous with the nation and something that we should have a sense of belonging to. And Richard sums this up from the high income district when he says, when I think of the economy, I think of the national state of play largely. If I was a younger man, I'd be terribly interested how the ship of state was going to fare, you know, and I'd hate to see us go down economically or have serious difficulties. And the way he talked about 2008 was that he thought that 2008 had probably reminded people how important the economy was. The second thing you could say about people from the high income districts was that they were following the economy, in some cases in a self-interested way, because they had savings, because they had mortgages. Some of them were speculating on shares, and so they would follow the stock exchange and so on. So they would say that they were very interested in it, and even the ones who didn't have such a direct interest in shares still felt that as good citizens, even though sometimes it was technical and boring, they would take an interest in the economic news. Now, there was distrust and opposition to economic experts in the high income district. There was a lot of anger that 2008 crisis had not been anticipated, and that the financial experts that you could associate with that had not served the country's interests. But when they talked about economists, their main criticism of them tended to be that they were divided. So a lot of the people I was talking to were medical professionals who would say, you know, the problem with economics is it's a pseudoscience, economists are divided, but there are some good economists. In some cases, if they were left of centre in the high income district, they would be saying the problem is we need to go back to Keynesian economics, as an example. So there was distrust, but it wasn't really deep. In contrast, if you go to the high income district, the reason that the book is called Rigged is because that's what people in the high income district saw the economy as. So what you've got here is, in the high income district, the sense that the economy is largely about impersonal forces. And this comes through, perhaps particularly in the way Conservative politicians talk about the economy, but actually sometimes politicians from other parties can give the impression that the economy is distinct from the human sphere, that it's about global flows and forces that are to some extent beyond their control, operating according to laws like supply and demand, which don't really apply in other aspects of everyday lives and also social sciences. But that really didn't resonate in the low income district. So in the low income district, there is real resistance to the idea that the economy is impersonal forces. Instead, the sense was that the rich controlled the economy and the rich wrote the rules, and that they essentially steered the economy in ways that benefited them. So I want to read a brief extract from Rosa, who was one of the people in the low income district. She was in her 40s, a teaching assistant who had a lot of poverty, particularly while she was bringing up her child, and who was very vocal on this sense that the first thing she thinks about when somebody says the economy is it's rigged. Economy now, bottomless pit, rip off Britain. I think the economy is built on being ripped off, actually. The trickle-down effect of the economy, I've seen little cartoony videos of that. I've said, oh yes, definitely get that. And at the start of the recession, they say, oh, we'll have to be in a recession because we can't afford the national health system. But hey, let's throw a few £billions into the stock market so the rich don't get poorer. And we'll just take all the money from the poor and let them be poorer. I do feel that that has been done in the last few years, big time. So another striking difference, which I did actually count again, was how often in the course of similarly length interviews, people on low incomes would talk about groups of people, human beings in the context of the economy. And it was far, far more than the people in the high income district who tended to talk in the abstract about these forces. And the term that people in the low income district used over and over again was that there are the rich, they write the rules, they're in control, and then there are the poor. Occasionally they'd use terms like middle class and working class, but actually it was striking how rich and poor were the most popular terms. And linked with this is a real sense that the economy is, that they are disconnected from the economy. The people in the high income district felt far more involved and that they in some way contributed to it. Whereas in the low income district, there was a sense that it really was this very distant phenomenon, distant from their lives, the economy. Finally, the distrust was far, far greater. So they felt that the economists were helping the rich essentially to write the rules and were far angrier about economists. And this was true whether they were on the Leave or the Remain side in the referendum. And even some of the Leave supporters had recognised that what they thought were dubious claims, such as about £350 million on the side of the bus. So there was a sort of general feeling of exasperation about use of statistics and what they saw as economic expertise that also related back to the 2008 crisis. Now, there are three big questions that I'm hoping there will be questions on that seem important coming out of this. First of all, the question of divisions. I just want to emphasize again that you could have two people in the high income district, one of whom was a conservative Brexiteer, the other of whom was a left of centre Remainer, but there was still some underlying sense of the economy that they shared, of it as a positive phenomenon, as something that was about impersonal forces. So I do think that at this underlying level, there are some significant divisions according to income, which leads me to believe that if you're looking at the causes of perceptions of the economy, what makes people have the pictures they do have when they hear the words the economy, that it's economic conditions that really shape those perceptions of the economy. And a big question is, are those perceptions changing? Are people on low incomes becoming more negative about the economy, more disconnected from it, more inclined to see it as rigged? And I can't definitively answer that question because there have not been very many similar political ethnographic studies to mine from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, to compare it with. But the participants themselves thought that things had got worse. Those who were, say, over about 30 felt that, particularly since the 2008 crisis and the aftermath, low wages, casualised work and austerity, that had made perhaps the most dramatic difference in their memories of how they had been perceiving the economy. And that means that in terms of a discussion about how it might change in the future and also what effects perceptions of the economy have, I think the situation is quite complicated. So First of all, I'm interested in why people vote the way they do, and it seems as if these underlying perceptions of the economy haven't really been affecting which party people vote for. But I think, as a lot of the writers, political economists on depoliticisation have suggested, that there may have been a sense in which particularly some of the low-income participants have felt that there wasn't a lot of point in paying attention to what politicians were saying about the economy, partly because it just didn't seem to have been a phenomenon that had been benefiting them in the last 10 years or so since the crash, but also because they'd absorbed this message that politicians in some ways were implying that they couldn't actively steer it and intervene in it. There is a little bit of evidence, not from my study, but obviously from a bigger quantitative study, that Corbyn's economic policies did appeal a bit to people on very low incomes in the 2017 election, in the sense that there was a slight increase in turnout among people from very low incomes in the 2017 election, which may suggest that in certain political situations you might get a re-engagement of people on low incomes, either who are presently not turning out to vote, or maybe even switching parties for economic reasons. But at the moment, we obviously have a situation where I think at the last election, certainly, people didn't seem to be voting according to economic self-interest. So the huge question is, what difference might COVID make? Because I had been thinking before COVID-19 struck that if economic conditions changed in the sense that people could see a more direct connection between what was happening with GDP, for instance, or employment levels and their own lives, than had been the case in the slightly peculiar economic period we've had since 2008, then maybe that would make them re-engage a bit more with economic issues. With COVID, you've got all sorts of potential scenarios, because you could find, if we experience for the first time since the 1980s very high unemployment, that people feel really connected to the economy in a far more negative way than even in the period of stagnant growth in wages since 2008. At the same time, we've had much more confusing messages from Conservative politicians about the extent to which they can intervene in the economy and steer it. So I'd be really interested in what anybody thinks might happen as a result of COVID-19 in terms of perceptions of the economy. But I think my main message would be from this book that at the point we went into COVID-19, we were already very divided along income lines, and that some kind of quite fundamental disconnection was being felt, particularly on the part of people on low incomes, when it came to the economy, economic issues. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that excellent talk. And I think this is a great time to open up the event to questions from the audience. So if you haven't already done so, please do type your questions into the questions option of the event dashboard. So first of all, Anna, what led you to this research?
I was a teacher and wanted to go back to university to do a PhD. And I was actually a history teacher. And what's really interesting about that is that you teach something like the rise of the Nazi Party, and you find yourself with 14, 15-year-olds, because the syllabus requires it and the exam requires it, saying, what do you think the economic causes of the rise of the Nazi Party were. And these students would just look at you completely blankly, because in their world, there was no category called economic. There was no category called political or social either, really. But it was almost as if you as a teacher would have to train them into how to think about the economy. And I would be very frustrated with myself, because I just keep saying, well, if it's to do with money, something to do with money, then it's economic. And I think it combined with a sense on their part that the economic side of history, for example, was harder to understand, that they felt it was this very distant and technical phenomenon. All of that led me to want to try to do some kind of research into underlying perceptions of it and how it affected political behaviour.
Thank you very much. And another question, how did you decide on the city in which you conducted this research?
Well, I don't mention it by name, but it's quite a poor city on the south coast that's had a lot of deindustrialization, and it was partly convenience, and it was partly that you know, unlike some other south coast cities, it did have quite high levels of child poverty, quite high levels of unemployment. A lot of the employment was in retail and low paid and elementary kind of occupations. So given that logistically I couldn't do field work in one of the northern cities, there just wasn't the budget for it. I thought that this highlighted actually how there can even be some particular economic hardships in some southern cities to do with less available housing, for example, and higher cost housing. But that would be a follow-on to this research. I mean, there are so many other studies that could be done which would compare, for example, a northern city and a southern city, or might compare how people are thinking about the economy in a vibrant city where there are a lot of job opportunities, compared to what a lot of political scientists call the more left behind areas. So there are other pieces of fieldwork that I think could be done to make this a more complete picture.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. How do you think people's perceptions and understanding of the economy shifted in the years before the 2008 crash?
That's a very good question, and a lot of the depoliticisation theorists say that the turning point was the establishment of the neoliberal paradigms, the shift from Keynesian demand management in the 1970s, where since the war you tended to have a Labour Party going into an election saying to voters, I will steer the economy in the direction of full employment. I will make sure the working class benefit from our management of the economy. And you'd have the Conservative Party often emphasising controlling inflation and implying that they would be more pro-business and lower tax and benefit the middle classes. So I think that's a bit of a caricature, but there does tend to be a sense that up until the Thatcher period, maybe there was this link between Labour's economic policies and working class votes to a slightly greater extent. Thatcher's deindustrialisation, greater attention to free markets, to some extent, there are again a lot of writers on this, people like Colin Hay, who would say that Labour under Blair in some ways carried on some of this sense that the economy is increasingly beyond politicians' control because it's getting more globalized and we need to maintain global competitiveness. So I think that there is some evidence that even though there were economic good times from, you know, the late 1990s through to the 2008 crisis, and a lot of people experienced growth in their incomes, there is nevertheless some evidence that some lower income voters began to think that the Labour governments in the Blair era weren't necessarily acting for them as a kind of special group, and that some of that old relationship between low income voters and the Labour Party and what the Labour Party could do for them economically had been lost. So I think people have been very alienated from the economy in some ways by the rhetoric that we've had on both free markets and globalization until, you know, for the last 20 or 30 years.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. What research methodologies did you employ when conducting the research for this book? Well,
you know, I'm passionately interested in methodology, and I've got quite a big section in the book on it. It is really complicated because, as I was saying, because I knew from pilot interviews that just saying to people, what goes through your mind when you think of the economy, doesn't really get you very far. I did use this methodology from social representation theory of giving people more concrete things to latch onto. So the phrasing I would use is employment, for example. What do you understand? What do you feel you know and understand about employment? And that's quite a good way of phrasing it, because if you ask people, what do you believe about employment, or what do you believe about the economic effects of migration, they kind of get the sense that you're putting that you, the researcher, are trying to find out what their beliefs are. They start plucking beliefs out of their minds that they might not really even have, but just for the sake of saying something. So I think to ask people about, you know, is there anything that you feel you do understand at all about this subject, and to get them talking about it was more revealing in the end. And I also asked people about their economic life stories, which could have been a whole book in itself, because when people really think through what kind of housing they were born into, what kind of jobs their parents were doing at the point when they were born, how that progressed and changed, then they can get quite emotional about it. And it does also really reveal insights about how people see the economy at the aggregate level through the lens of their own personal experiences of it. Other methods I used were follow-up focus groups with some of the participants, and also a certain amount of participant observation, in the sense that I take field notes, a bit like anthropologists do, sort of very detailed, trying to observe, trying to critically reflect. I attended tenants association meetings and spent a lot of time walking around in the district and striking up conversations with people informally, and that gave me insights which, if people did agree to let me interview them, really helped. And I should say that I am very grateful to everyone who let me interview them, because so many of them did it in their own homes as well, which is a real privilege, because it means that you're talking to people on their home ground. You know, you're getting extra insights into what their lives are like. They are speaking more openly perhaps than they would be in some neutral research office somewhere, and that made a huge difference, that people let me do that, and that we had cups of tea, and you know, we were kind of talking to their children and all the rest of it.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. What do you think is the #1 thing that people want from their economy?
That's a really good question. And in a way, I wasn't asking them, what is your ideal economy, which is something that some anthropologists and sociologists have done, and I think it's something that political scientists should do. But if I got an impression, I do actually think it was security. Security that goes with enough money to live. There was just a real sense that we were going back to the Victorian times, where people would go down to the docks and it would be a question of chance who picked them up, you know, which employer picked them up to work for a day. And you know, the pressure on people who were doing jobs like minimum wage cleaning jobs or minimum wage in care homes or close to minimum wage in retail or cafes, where they were on 0 hours contracts, and there just was a kind of constant feeling that the employer was hanging over them. And if I can also bring in what some people in this city felt about the economic effects of migration, this is a city that had a lot of people coming to work in it from other European Union member countries. And there was a sense that free movement had enabled the employers to go down this more 0 hours route and to put more pressure on them to have you know, a really sort of you could say a kind of over eager work ethic, because there would be so many other people that would take the job if you fell out with the employer, or the employer thought that you were cutting corners in some way. So yeah, I think a secure, reasonably high status, reasonably well paid job.
Thank you very much, Anna. We have another question. How would you like this book to be used?
Well, I wrote it for a general readership because I try to write it in a reasonably accessible way. I think chapter 1 has got some kind of more political science and political economic theoretical stuff in it, but I hope that at some point it will be published as a paperback, because I think the voices of people, particularly people on low incomes, are not heard enough. So I tried to reproduce quite lengthy quotes in the book, so that there is as much of people's voices unmediated as possible. And I think there's too much of most political scientists are from middle class backgrounds, and there is a bit of a sense that the way we sort of middle class academics see the world is the way the world should be seen, and is the sort of bottom line, the taken for granted assumption. And I think what this book does is it does challenge that the economy isn't some kind of a shorthand that everybody understands in the same way. You know, it means very different things to different people, and actually people on low incomes, often their sense of what the economy is as sophisticated, as knowledgeable in different areas as some of the higher income people that I was talking to, who you know, follow the FTSE closely. So I think it's also about how there are different forms of sophistication about the economy as well.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. To what extent was there anti-immigration feeling in the poorer area?
There was anti-immigration feeling in both areas. So there were 24 in the high income area. And I would say in that high income area, there were a few who were, you know, I said, what are the economic effects of migration? And they immediately started to talk about the cultural effects, and in a way indicated that their opposition to immigration was quite a lot to do with cultural differences, what they perceived as cultural differences. However, on balance, I would say the proportion of people in the low income district who said they were opposed to migration and had sort of quite strong arguments against it was higher. So in the high income district, there was a sense that migrants were lively, educated people who were good to employ. Whereas in the low income district, the sense was people who are coming in to the city are taking my job at a lower rate and driving the employers down the 0 hours route and taking the social housing, for instance, which was in really short supply. So very different relationships to migration. And one thing I will say is that I think some political scientists have downplayed the economic perceptions that some people who are against migration have. So, you know, even though there were a lot of generalizations about how, you know, nearly all the migrants coming in were claiming benefits, for example, there is, I think, more that needs to be done about the effects of migration, for example, on the casualisation of work and the growth of 0 hours contracts, and on wage rates in unskilled areas in particular.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one final question. What was the most surprising thing that you learned when conducting the research for this book?
That's a really difficult question. Probably the most surprising thing I learned was, first of all, how terrible payday loan debt was, because I haven't ever been in payday loan debt, and the effects of debt on people's lives who really don't think they're ever going to get out of it, and then have to go in these things called debt management plans where you're accounting for every single penny, was quite devastating to see. And the kinds of bravery and psychological mechanisms that I think people used to actually carry on meaningful lives despite the kind of pressure from payday loan debts was probably very surprising. And finally, kind of in reverse, I found it surprising how moralistic some of the high income participants were about debt, because I've never really thought that getting into debt was in some way a kind of moral weakness, but that was quite a strong perception in the high income district.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anna. So I think this is a good moment to wrap up this armchair event and to thank everyone for attending, but also thank you, Anna, for giving up your time to participate.